She wants the lights down.
Yeah, just probably just put it to the best.
Do you know offhand how the program will run with the slides? If it's going to be from the whole talk?
No, I think you can ask her, she's right there. That was the chairperson of the Catherine A. Coughlin Film Lectureship, which is a biennial lectureship that we give in honor of a beloved teacher, friend, and former dean of this college, who is among us today. Catherine A. Coughlin was the one who introduced film studies, film criticism, to the curriculum here. I will turn the program over to Marjorie Hellerstein, who is the chairperson of the Critical Studies Department, in one moment. When Ms. Michelson is through with her talk, we would like you to come to the third floor to the visitors' lounge for refreshments and a chance to speak with her. And now I'll turn the program over to Marjorie Hellerstein.
This is just a brief introduction to give you something of the background of our speaker. Annette Michelson studied art history and philosophy at Columbia University and the University of Paris. She lived in Paris for 15 years, where she was consecutively art editor of the Paris edition of the New York Herald Tribune, Paris correspondent for Arts magazine, and Paris correspondent for Art International. Following her return to the United States, she was editor for film and performance of Artforum magazine. In 1976, she and Rosalind Krauss founded the journal October, which is now 10 years old and celebrating that, which is devoted to the theoretical and critical consideration of contemporary art in its historical and political context. She is presently professor of cinema studies at New York University. Professor Michelson has received a number of fellowships and grants and has published studies on the works of Duchamp, Michael Snow, Eisenstein, Darren, Rainier, Kubrick, Cornell, Brakhage, Breton, and many others. She is editor and co-translator of Kino I, an English-language edition of the theoretical writings of Dziga Vertov, and is presently at work, or perhaps she's finished, on a critical reconsideration of the Soviet cinema in the immediate post-revolutionary period. Her lecture this afternoon is based on the film you just saw, Harry Smith's film Heaven and Earth Magic. And now for the lecture, The Mummy's Return, a Kleining film scenario.
Thank you. Let me repeat the title and the subtitle of my talk, The Mummy's Return, a Kleinian film scenario. And I'll begin with an epigraph that comes from Harry Smith, the maker of the film, who said, however, my films aren't made by me, I'm just the medium. They're really made by God. In the work that I shall be doing with you this afternoon, I'm going to read, by the way, most of this simply because there's a lot of it and I don't want to leave anything out. I'm sorry for what may seem the formality of this offering. I will try and develop some elements for an approach to and a textual analysis of the film you've just seen. But I don't want to begin without paying tribute to the two men who are responsible for its conservation and exhibition on the one hand, and on the other, for the first important critical assessment of this extraordinary work, whose visual splendor, by the way, is the product of that fine artisanal tradition which characterizes the new American cinema. It is therefore to Jonas Mekas and to P. Adams Sidney, without whose passionate dedication to that cinema in general and to the work of Harry Smith in particular, a dedication as resistant to general public indifference as to the caprices of the artist himself. It is to them that we owe the inclusion of this work in what I think we may call the canon of the new American cinema. We owe to Sidney as well his assiduous investigation of the iconographical sources, both obscure and fascinating, as I think we will see, of Smith's film. And these, by the way, will continue to provide the basis of any coherent reading of the text. And we are indebted to Sidney for something equally precious and essential, in my view, which is to say his unique ability to stimulate in Smith a kind of phantasmatic meditation upon his own life history. Sidney alone has managed to elicit from Smith a kind of not only informative, but marvelously outrageous, a series of musings upon his life, which we will take with a grain of salt, as Smith himself absorbs information with grains of other substances. But I want to say that I consider his remarks as constituting, together with the films themselves, a field, a fairly unified field, which must be studied as such, for they illuminate each other. And there are, by the way, not too many filmmakers about whom we can say this. I could cite Eisenstein, Darren, Brakhage, Godard, Frampton, a few others. But I want now to declare as well that my approach and my preoccupations will lead me to differ with Sidney's reading of this film, which is known variously as The Magic Feature and Heaven and Earth Magic. I differ in certain important respects, and I will differ too with a very interesting interpretation proposed by Noel Carroll. Unlike Sidney, I feel constrained to look beyond, or shall we say beneath the details of Smith's own account of a spiritual quest. For Sidney, Heaven and Earth Magic shares with the mythopoeic cinema of Brakhage, Anger, and Markopolis the theme of the divided being or splintered consciousness, which must be reintegrated. That was a quotation, by the way. This first intuition seems to me not only sound, it is powerfully explanatory. Can you hear me better now? Yeah. But only, I think, on condition that we go on to examine the ground of that division and splintering, not, as Sidney proposes, to see it as yet another part of the legacy of Romanticism, that is his phrase, in which a drama of transcendence and spiritual salvation are enacted, but rather we must propose, I think, and I want to do that, another more concrete and more fully explanatory set of terms for its reading. For Noel Carroll, who wrote an essay called Mind, Medium, and Metaphor in Harry Smith's Heaven and Earth Magic, published in 1977, the film instantiates a view of the mind derivative of or consonant with that of a British empiricist philosophical tradition of the 18th century, that of Hume in particular, who envisioned the mind as a kind of box, a space, a room, a scene, a theater, filled with decor or objects. This view is not uninteresting, but I find it insufficient. It seems to me that we need, in order to understand this film as a whole, in all its variety, its serial repetitions, its constantly postponed resolutions, some approach that is more fully explanatory. And I have in mind, of course, the narrative, as well as the dynamics of this film. We want to account for its material aspect as a collage, to take into account the fact that this collage offers the incessant fragmentation and restoration of the human body, and of a woman's body in particular, that these operations are performed magically by a man of singularly small stature, that not only is he indeed the central agent of the apparitions, vanishing acts, transformations, deformations, but that his magic is largely communicated through acts of aggression performed with the aid of a magic weapon. The text gives us, I think, also a couple of linguistic hints that have been overlooked. Smith, as reported by Sidney, once, while improvising a kind of lecture to a group of students, told them to look at films as hieroglyphs. He said, you shouldn't be looking at any film as a continuity. Film frames are hieroglyphs, even when they look like actuality. You should think of the film frame always as a glyph, and then you'll understand what cinema is about. It's certainly true that within Smith's own work, the hieroglyph is essential. More than that, we have to look at it perhaps differently in a way that extends the meaning of the hieroglyph behind and further than Smith's recommendation and Sidney's acceptance. We have to look at them perhaps as constituting a rebus, that mixture of signs, pictures, words, conventional signs, whose deciphering will bring us closer to the understanding of this work. It is now perhaps evident that I'm going to take my first cue from that prime interpreter of the rebus, Freud, and that my method will be psychoanalytic. A recent film theory, unlike the earliest psychoanalytic work on film, has not been very concerned with the analysis of what we call the film text itself. Rather, it has analyzed the position of the spectator in relation to the film screen and to the entire institution of cinema, to the power of what has been termed the cinematic apparatus. Its basis, as you probably know, lies in one theoretical formulation by Freud in a late paper published in 1927, in which it's a paper on fetishism, the psychopathology of fetishism, in which the position or the attitude of the fetishist is described as one of disavowal of his traumatic discovery of his mother's lack of the phallus and his fear of his own castration. The inability to accept this generates the insistent disavowal of the reality of this fact. Freud says, I quote, to put it plainly, the fetish is a substitute for the woman's phallus which the little boy once believed she had, as everyone has, and doesn't wish to forego, for if mother has lost hers, he too is subject to that threat of castration. He retains this belief, but he also gives it up. During the conflict between the dead weight of the unwelcome perception and the force of the opposite wish, a compromise is constructed, such as is only possible in the realm of unconscious thought by the primary processes. The fetishist knows, but, and that is essentially his attitude. Such, then, film theorists have been arguing over the last decade or so, is the position of the film viewer in relation to the power of cinematic representation. We know that what is happening up on the screen is not real, but nevertheless, such is the force of that representation that we disavow that knowledge. Now, that has been the main axis around which film theoretical discourse has operated to renew the possibilities of psychoanalytic criticism. I want today to take one step toward shifting the psychoanalytic method of inquiry back to the film itself, to the film text. I will take the film practice and the discourse of Smith together and investigate them as the articulations of a particular position. My method, then, is going to be drawn from psychoanalysis, but more particularly from what we know as the theory of object relations, theorized, analyzed, and documented for us in Melanie Klein's extensive work in the psychoanalysis of young children. Klein, stressing the importance of the psyche's development within its earliest months, totally revised dominant notions of the infant's life during the first months and its consequences for adult development. She adopted for her theorizing the term position in preference to that of the stage or the phase, thereby marking not only the transitory aspect of infantile development, but the relational aspect fundamental to the child's existence. For as one of her eminent followers, D.W. Winnicott, has remarked, there's really no such thing as a baby. There are only babies with mothers. And Klein chose the term position, that is to say, one can only understand the baby in relation, seen in relation to its mother, even if that mother is absent. The absence of that mother is a prime factor. Klein chose the term position because though the phenomena that she speaks of occur in the first place during early stages of development, they are not confined to these stages, but represent specific groupings of anxieties and defenses which appear and reappear during the first years of childhood. Now, it's essential to realize that she, in opposition to dominant psychoanalytic thought of her time, believed that sufficient ego exists from birth so as to generate anxieties characteristic of psychosis, which drive the ego to develop specific defense mechanisms. She began then by extending the history of the psychoanalytic subject far backward, emphasizing anxieties, defenses, and relations as constituting from the very earliest infancy on crucial factors in ego development. She developed essentially a history of the earliest development of the child in terms of two positions, as she called them. And the first of these is the paranoid schizoid position, the earlier of the two, and it's operative in the first 3 to 5 months of the infant's life. Adopting Freud's topology of the psyche and the theory of instinctual drives, she accepted as well Freud's relatively late explanation of the death instinct as the motive force behind aggressive impulses. Freud said, the dominating tendency of mental life, and perhaps of nervous life in general, is the effort to reduce, to keep constant, or to remove internal tension due to stimuli. Balancing the impulse toward annihilation, which characterizes the death instinct, are the preservative, sexual instincts, the life instincts. The death instinct lies behind many psychical processes, that is to say, repetition compulsion, for example. But important for any discussion of Klein is the idea that the libido must render the death instinct innocuous to itself, with the result that the death instinct is inflected outwards toward objects in the external world. A new theory of aggression then holds that it is the product of the bipolar struggle between life and death instincts. Now, the Kleinian infant at this early stage of development does not relate to external reality as a group of entire or whole objects, mother, father, but rather as part objects, and first and fundamentally the mother's breast. Furthermore, this part object, the breast, is experienced as dual, twofold. When present to satisfy the infant's hunger, it functions as a good breast, nourishing and satisfying. When absent, during hunger, it is felt, it is sensed as the bad breast, frustrating and denying. The deflected death instinct generates the belief that the bad breast is not simply bad, it is deliberately persecutory. It is attacking the infant in order to annihilate. And even in this simple schematization, a wealth of psychical processes are active, so that objects for the infant become extensions of the self, endowed with qualities of independence. At the same time, the infant, as they say, introjects the object and its associated qualities, creating within its own psyche the feeling of an internalized good breast or bad breast. The internal objects are idealized constructs and become the prototypes for later life of all helpful and gratifying objects, or, as in the case of the bad breast, the prototype of all external and internal persecutory objects. Such a process of introjection or absorption and holding of internal objects corresponds in Kleinian thought to the beginning of the formation of the superego, although interestingly enough, the splitting of the object there is a splitting of the object which is necessarily concurrent with a splitting of the ego, as the infant attempts to separate its good and bad objects as much as possible. Splitting objects means to split those qualities which the infant has internalized, and since the qualities are largely derived from the infant's feelings, the infant's ego, the ego must split as well. Thus, the bad breast comes to possess the oral sadistic impulses which actually stem from the infant's own feelings of envy. Destructive fantasies of biting, devouring, and annihilating the breast, the mother's body, are prevalent when the infant is in a state of such paranoid anxiety, because the infant fears that the breast will attack the infant in the same way. So that what we get is an account of extreme states of anxiety and violence within the very young infant. I began this exposition of Kleinian theory by remarking that its insistence upon extending the subject's psychoanalytic history back into very earliest months of infancy met with great resistance in dominant theory. I now want to stress the extreme hostility it elicited, and still in some quarters elicits, and perhaps to add the reason for that. It is due largely to the extreme intensity of the psychotic states of the infantile psyche as described in this relocation. Both the precocity and the violence, I must parenthetically add, were derived and confirmed by Klein's extensive work over several decades in both Germany and England in the undeveloped field of the psychoanalysis of children, which her pioneering efforts shaped. In the process, she has delivered to us, as it were, a scenario of infantile development whose complex violence does require a real adjustment of perspective, even in those already disabused of the idealization of childhood affected by Freudian analysis. The paranoid schizoid position is the first of the two positions. The second is known as the depressive position, and it is initiated during approximately the 4th or 5th month of the infant's life and will be resolved sometime within the first year, climaxing before, during, and after weaning. But we must remember that Klein's choice of the term position is occasioned by the view that depressive anxieties and the defenses appropriate to them will be reenacted throughout the subject's adult life, predominantly in moments of grief, mourning, and depression. Thus, the child's growing skills, gifts, and arts increase his belief in the psychic reality of his constructive tendencies, his capacity to master and control his hostile impulses, as well as his bad internal objects. There's a stress on the fundamental importance for the depressive position, because it's at this point that certain fundamental aspects of the child in his relationship to reality, both internal and external, are developed and put into motion. The primary difference between the child in this position and in the previous one is that the ego, perceiving the mother now as a whole and independent object, distinguishes itself as an I, a self, separate from, yet dependent upon her. Previously, the child related to part objects, the breast being, as we have seen, the primary one. Now, grounded in the fundamental physiological changes which increase the child's perceptual faculties, it can now focus its eyes, it can follow the mother's with its eyes, it can differentiate amongst the sounds made by the mother. The child is now capable of connecting the part objects, breast, smile, hands, etc., with the mother as a unified person. In other words, the child integrates the repetition of the mother's movements, gestures, sounds, and images as perceived through the senses of sight, hearing, touch, into one unified whole, the mother. Perception of the mother as a whole object results in a decrease in the intensity of splitting. In the paranoid schizoid position, splitting resulted from the attempt to separate the good and bad. But in the depressive position, the infant becomes aware that the object, the mother, embodies both. The mother is source of both love and hate, of satisfaction and frustration, of the projected life and death instincts. Through projection of aggressive and destructive fantasies onto the mother, the child now comes to believe that it may lose the mother totally, that it will lose all aspects of the mother. The child's main anxieties spring from ambivalence and the child's feeling that his own destructive impulses have destroyed or will destroy the object that he loves and upon which he is totally dependent. And he therefore, in order to defend against this threat of loss, the infant cultivates defenses which relate to defenses from the first position, splitting, omnipotence. They're intensified. The child builds up omnipotent and violent fantasies, partly for the purpose of controlling and mastering the bad, dangerous objects, and partly in order to save and restore the loved ones. Omnipotence, denial, and idealization, closely bound up with ambivalence, enable the young child to assert itself to a certain degree against what it senses to be its internal persecutors, and against a slavish and perilous dependence upon its loved objects, and thus to make further advances in its development. But along with these, and in place of these, the child cultivates what is for us the most important aspect of the depressive position: reparative, restorative tendencies, in which the child actively seeks to repair the damage, the loss inflicted on the good object. It is thus that the child successfully works through the depressive position. Guilt, in which the child says or feels, "I have caused destruction," is activated into, "I will fix this." Or as Klein paraphrases the child's utterance, "My mother is disappearing. She may never return. She is suffering. She is dead. No, this can't be, for I can revive her." The child not only puts itself into the position of being the catalyzer of destruction, it now seeks to diminish the anxieties it experiences through an active, constructive, restorative process, and this evolves through love. Reparation is not a simple process of working through depressive anxieties, however, for the act of reparation is itself a controlling or omnipotent impulse, which, as Klein states, is closely aligned with sadistic impulses leading to the reintroduction of manic defenses. It is therefore only through repetition of reparative tendencies and reinforcement and successful introjection of strong internal good objects that the infant will be led to trust its own loving, constructive tendencies. And this, finally, is of particular importance because Klein and her followers, including the aesthetician and art historian Adrian Stokes, felt and have argued that there is a link between the reparative impulse and creative activity. To have trust in one's own creative reparative powers seems to be of fundamental importance to the normal development of everyone, but it is, moreover, the generative source of artistic creation in particular. Now, it is surely evident to you, after this long expository interlude, that I am proposing to you that we read the film you have just seen, known variously as The Magic Feature or Heaven and Earth Magic, as the elaborate working through in the form of reparation offered by artistic creation of the spectrum of infantile psychosis through paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. And our first step toward that reading will be to account for the initial and concluding images of the film, which, by the way, I note with more than casual interest and amusement. Neither of the two preceding exegetes I mentioned, Sidney and Carroll, has troubled to account for in their own reading. The image of a little man who begins this epic of slaughter and resurrection by introducing, literally carrying on to the screen or stage, as it were, the other central character, whose name we read as in a rebus, a mummy. Mummy is dead, imprisoned, encased in her box or coffin. And it is from that initial point on that we feel, I feel, impelled to read The Magic Feature as an extremely overt articulation of what has come to be known as the Kleinian scenario of infantile development, a horror feature indeed, and the longest running one known to us. For it presents the narrative of the ever recommencing struggle of the little man endowed in fantasy with magical powers of aggression, insemination, of restoration, constantly engaged in the repetition compulsion of assault upon and fragmentation of Mummy's body, in restoration of it as a whole, until, to quote Smith, he says, then there's a graveyard scene when the dead are all raised again. What actually happens at the end of the film is everybody's put in a teacup because all kinds of horrible monsters came out of the graveyard like animals that folded into one another. Then everybody gets thrown in a teacup, which is made out of a head and stirred up. This is the trip to heaven and the return, then the Noah's Ark, then the raising of the dead, and finally the stirring of everyone in a teacup. Smith's account reads like the discourse of children in psychoanalytic session, but consider Sidney's account of the little man whom we see all through the film. I quote, although Smith, this is Sidney, has described him as having the same function as the prop mover in traditional Japanese theater, his continual manipulation in the alchemical context of number 12, this film is also known as Opus number 12 in Smith's completed works. His almost absolute resistance to change, when everything else, including the heroine, is in constant metamorphosis, elevates him to the status of a magus. According to the argument of the film, he injects her with a magical potion while she sits in a diabolical dentist's chair. She rises to heaven and becomes fragmented. The elaborate exposition of the heavenly land occurs while the magus attempts a series of operations to put her back together again. He does not succeed until they are eaten by the giant head of a man and are descending to earth in an elevator. Their arrival coincides with an obscure celebration seen in scatological imagery, the great sewer to which Smith refers in his musings, and in which a cinematic recapitulation of the journey blends into an ending which is the exact reversal of the opening shots. That's the end of Sidney's description. However, I want, first of all, to clarify something. One reference of Sidney's, he talks about the alchemical context of this film, which is certainly a film of transformations. In one of the wonderful interviews which Sidney did with Smith, Smith telling the story of his life gives us very interesting images of his parents. Among them, the story of his 12th birthday. It says, on which my father presented me with an entire blacksmith's blacksmith's shop, and commanded me to change lead into gold. Now, it is at this point, that is to say, at the point of the working through of the second position, the depressive position, that the plot of the Kleinian scenario as prototype thickens. For when the infant begins to realize that his parents are persons and feels that they're not only objects for his needs and wishes, that they have a life of their own and with one another, the infant enters upon the triangular stage of his relation with his parents. He does not merely add the whole object to his part objects, it's also the relationship between his father and mother which becomes a significant part of his life. And the first establishment of an emotional triangle with his parents is the beginning of what we know as the Oedipus complex. Increasingly, the infant's emotions, impulses, and fantasies center upon the parental couple. It is, says Freud, to this phase that we attribute the origin of the unconscious equation of breast, penis, feces, child, etc., and the infantile sexual theories, which Freud discovered and related to the child between the 3rd and 5th years. Thus, the theory of parental intercourse as feeding or as excretion, of babies being conceived through the mouth, and birth as taking place through the anus, show the overlapping of oral, excretory, and procreative urges and fantasies in the young child. The notion of the primal scene or the castrating phallic mother betray the fusion of libidinal and cruel impulses characteristic of early infantile genitality. Now, a 3-year-old child is capable of verbalizing some of these fantasies, but he has them much earlier, at a time which he expresses them, that is, the time which he expresses them does not coincide with the date of their origin. Adolescence normally shows the reemergence of early infantile sexuality. When the adolescent, in horror, turns away from his impulses, it is not only because he discovers his incestuous object choice, the wish to sleep with his mother, but because he becomes aware that he is attracted and excited by perverse and cruel fantasies. Now, I am going to proceed by unveiling, as it were, the second major figure of the scenario. For the baby's mummy is, of course, attached to a daddy, and the dyad becomes a trio. Now, our baby in this film is, of course, a little man, a homunculus, formed in the image of daddy and wielding that powerful instrument of daddy's, the secret of his power over both mummy and baby, that hammer, and over all things in general. His power is, as we've seen in the film, a magic power, the source of omnipotence. But the little man in this magic feature, in this representation of the Kleinian scenario, is not just any anonymous little man. He is a particular one. Mummies, chic and dainty avatars, have been cut out of the fashion plates of Godey's Lady's Book, publication of the 19th century. But the little man is taken from another book, a different one, from a very particular book, from the illustrations for a volume by Dr. Daniel Gottlob Moritz Schreber, entitled Medical Indoor Exercises. Dr. Schreber, an extremely important and celebrated German pedagogue of the last century, has now receded into the past, eclipsed by the celebrity of his son, Daniel Paul Schreber, whose Memoirs of a Mental Patient, published in Leipzig in 1903, described in great detail not only his life in mental institutions over a period of about 14 years, but also the excruciating periods of disturbance which preceded them. These periods are described with a candor that led the Schreber family to buy up and destroy the book after publication. The few copies of the original memoirs that remained attracted, of course, wide attention in psychiatric circles. And one of these copies came into Freud's possession in Vienna in 1910, and the eventual result was Freud's penetrating analysis of the case, published in 1911, the only major case history published without direct contact with the patient, on the basis of this admittedly abundant documentary evidence. The analysis of Schreber is generally considered as a powerfully seminal text, as the forerunner of numerous related studies in the area of paranoia, and further comments on paranoia and on the case followed in other important theoretical texts of Freud. And there has been, for reasons which are going to be, I think, immediately clear to you, a further renewal of interest and revision of the approach that Freud took to this case. Undoubtedly, one of the interesting aspects of the case was the status and rank of Schreber, who was a jurist and occupied, in fact, the position of presiding judge of the Court of Appeals in Dresden, the capital of Saxony. His account is long, extraordinarily detailed, and presents all the density and obsession with detail, the involved logic, which characterized the discourse of the paranoiac. It was translated into English in 1955. Schreber invents a special terminology, which he calls Grundsprache, ground language or root language, and which he attributes to God or to divine rays emanating from God. These rays were the means of communication between himself and the divine source of his mission. His delusional system, as revealed in the memoirs, has been summarized as follows. 3 points, major ones. 1, he felt he had a mission to redeem the world and to restore it to its lost state of bliss. 2, this mission must be preceded by the destruction of the world and by his personal transformation into a woman. 3, transformed into a female, he, Judge Schreber, now a woman, would become God's mate, and out of such union a better and healthier race of men would emerge. He says, among many things, a force of attraction emanates from my single body over enormous distances. This may appear quite absurd. Nevertheless, the action of the force of attraction is a fact that is absolutely unquestionable. He, Schreber, is awakened by these rays, sometimes by a very painful process, to a new heavenly life, a state of bliss. For God, he says, only pure human nerves were usable because they were destined to become attached to God himself, and finally, to turn into parts of God as 4 courts of heaven, so to speak. This is Schreber's language. The male state of bliss, said Schreber, was on a higher level than the female state of bliss. The latter seems to have consisted, and this is Schreber speaking, of an uninterrupted sensation as the ultimate goal of all souls merged with other souls, coalescing into higher entities and feeling themselves as parts of God, parts of the omniscience and omnipresence of God, and the importance of the connection pre-established more than a century before. And he speaks as well of the importance of the connection pre-established more than a century before, the beginning of the 18th century, of the connection between the name of his family, Schreber, and that of his doctor, Flechtzig. His name was Dr. Flechtzig. And these connections, by the way, he says, are not limited to individual members of the family, but they play a part in what he termed the concept of soul murder carried out upon him by that figure, who his doctor, Flechtzig, whom he also attached to the image of his father and identified through his father with the figure of God. And I now have a few slides to show you to clarify this Schreber component. And I'll ask for the first slide now, please. We have the house lights down and the first slide. I think we need a little less light. Is there a light here? This is a part of the Schreber family tree. And Schreber's grandfather was Johann Gotthelf Daniel Schreber. The family tree shows you the persistence of the idea of God in the delusional, that part of the delusional system of Schreber, which is woven around the connection between his family name and that of his doctor. So, Schreber himself is the patient, Daniel Paul Schreber. He shared the name of Daniel with his grandfather, and he shared the name, he shared the name of Daniel with his grandfather and with his father. His physician's name was Paul, and he shared the name of Paul with his physician. His physician's middle name, however, is Theodore, as you will see. And of course, Theo is the Greek root of God. So that Gotthilf, Gottlieb, and Theodore are identified in his mind in a related line. In addition, he speaks very often of the Fürchtergott, that is to say, the fear of God. And he attributes to Flechtzig and to Flechtzig's assistants these godlike attributes and godlike names. So that we have here the building of a kind of semantic system which is extremely inventive and clever, and it has all the appurtenances of paranoid invention. Okay. Schreber eventually developed the delusion that he actually was a woman, declaring that he had feminine breasts and experiencing the voluptuousness of a female being. He also felt that he was the last real person left. That was his claim. Whereas others, including Professor Flechsig and Flechsig's attendants and patients, were nothing but what he called miracled up, cursorily or sketched, barely sketched, and many-headed little men. That is how he described them. His visions of the destruction of the world were of something that he felt to be of both a horrifying nature and of an indescribable splendor. Now, I'm interested in very briefly tracing the interest of Harry Smith, or accounting for the interest of Harry Smith in Schreber, and in the texts and drawings of Schreber's father, in accounting for their insertion, their central place in the magic feature. And I should begin by saying that Freud was particularly interested in the psychopathological process that brought about the ascent from Flechsig to God, a process in which the figure of the physician was ultimately replaced by the superior figure of God. And so it's now time for me to ask for the second slide. Here is a picture of Dr. Flechsig as he appeared in his study and as he must have appeared to his patients when they came to talk with him and to be examined in his study. It would be rather difficult not to identify this forbidding figure dominated by the huge kind of image of the brain as God. It would be rather difficult not to take him for God. May I have a little more light? Because I don't think there's a light on this stand and I can't see. May I have a bit more light, please? Well, it has to be possible. It has to be possible somehow. I really need some more light. Hello? Thank you. Now, I want to go a bit further, benefiting by recent research and inquiry into the Schreber case, by identifying just a little more clearly the father figure in the Schreber case, Dr. Daniel Gottlieb Schreber. He was a celebrated social, medical, and educational reformer. He taught in the medical school of the University of Leipzig. He wrote and published close to 20 books on social and pediatric care, social questions in pediatric care. He was described in his obituary as physician, teacher, nutritionist, anthropologist, therapeutic gymnast, and athlete, and above all, a man of action, of tremendous enthusiasm and endurance. Among the 20 books by Schreber's father, was a popular guidebook for parents and educators. Its title was Education to Beauty Through Natural and Symmetrical Promotion of Normal Body Growth. And it was an especial and important point of pride with its author that its methods, theoretically derived, were nevertheless actively and personally applied in the rearing of his own children. His educational system, as set forth to his readership of parents and educators, is based on the application of firm discipline, control, pressure, in the expectation that an early discipline will establish in the malleable years of childhood. Sorry, I can't see. I must have more light. The light's gone down again, and I need more light. Thank you. In the malleable years of childhood, a moral discipline and a physical muscular control that will ensure bodily health and mental soundness. Dr. Schreber invented for this system a set of exercises and physical controls which were applied to children and was certainly operative for his own children, including young Daniel Paul, judge. He seems to have been particularly concerned with the development of upright, straight posture in children. And in this he was not alone, certainly in Germany. But he was singular in his construction of varied and elaborate apparatus for the training in question. And I'm now going to show you a series of slides which will demonstrate the kinds of machines that he invented. I have about 7 or 8 of these, and we'll go through them fairly quickly. The first, may I have the next slide? Was called the Geradenhalter, a device designed to ensure erect sitting posture. The second, may I have the next slide please, shows us the practical application of the Geradenhalter. It's applied to the front of the children. Third slide please. This is the Kopfhalter, or head belt, whose use will become apparent soon. Fourth, the head belt, or Kopfhalter, can be applied to the Geradehalter. And here, in fact, it is. Next slide, please. These are braces designed to prevent or correct deformity of bowed legs. Next slide. This is a piece of apparatus for the perfection of a child's sleeping posture. Next slide, please. And here's an apparatus for use in sleeping to ensure that the child sleeps proper posture. Next slide, please. This is a simple physical exercise known as the bridge. And the next. These are drawings which come from a quite different book of Dr. Schreber. It is a book entitled The Pangymnastikon, which offers an entire gymnastic system condensed into one apparatus, the construction and application of which is described in his book. This device, ensuring that all gymnastic exercises are brought within the compass of a single piece of equipment, is viewed as the simplest means for achieving the fullest development of muscular strength and endurance. And it is from this set of illustrations and others like them that Schreber derived his own images of what he described as sketchily made or cursorily sketched little men with multiple heads. And just as surely, the entire delusional system of Schreber can be seen, in part at least, as the projection of the system of constraints imposed upon the body and psyche of the child of this extraordinary, totally controlling, godlike father. I think I implied at the outset of this long investigation that I was not going to offer more than the elements of analysis of heaven and earth magic. I'm certainly not at this point going to go through it shot by shot. And I'm not going to tax your patience any further by trying to situate the operation of the family triad within the text of the magic feature. I want us to remember, however, or I want you to remember, however, that at the age of 12, Smith received the command from his own father, a command impossible to fulfill. You must perform that magic feat which no one in the history of the world has yet achieved, the conversion of lead into gold. Smith has, however, offered us, in the visual splendor of the magic feature, the concerted, restorative, reparative offering in which the grief and anger of infantile psychosis are worked out of the existing body of 19th century illustration. He has cut, torn, pasted, and then restored and edited together the turbulent saga of the passage of schizoid paranoia and depression. Smith's claim that his films were made by some force speaking through him has only to be translated from the language of transcendence to that of immanence. It was the force, not of God, but of the little man, the homunculus, acting through him, which has converted that grief, that anger, those leaden directives of fashion and of pedagogical control into the gold of the magic feature. Thank you. I believe we were all asked to go to, the third floor, but if there is anyone who has an urgent question, I would be delighted to entertain it, or even a question not so urgent.